The massive alien ship hung in space like a silver leaf, its hull reflecting Earth's sunlight as it approached the blue planet. Inside, Ambassador Gray stood before the Galactic Council's viewing screen, his four eyes blinking in sequence as he studied the primitive world below. His tentacles moved across the control panel, bringing up streams of data about this newly discovered species called humans. "Another soft species," muttered Council Leader Stone, his crystalline body casting rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. "Look at their fragile bodies. No natural armor, no claws, not even basic radiation resistance." He moved closer to the screen, towering over Gray. "Why are we even considering contact?" Gray's skin shifted from pale blue to a thoughtful green. "The protocols are clear, sir. Any species that achieves spaceflight, however primitive, must be evaluated for potential membership." He pulled up more data streams. They managed to reach their own moon, send probes to nearby planets, and maintain a basic orbital station. That qualifies them for initial contact. The council chamber buzzed with the sounds of 20 different species discussing the matter. Some floated in anti-gravity fields, others stood on specialized platforms, and a few existed as pure energy forms contained in special vessels. They all shared one thing. None of them saw humans as anything but a curiosity. "Their physical statistics are almost amusing," commented Science Director Beam, her light form flickering with amusement. "Average lifespan under 100 years. Limited strength, poor sensory capabilities. They can't even see most of the color spectrum." She projected more images of humans going about their daily lives, though they do show remarkable adaptability. Gray studied the images carefully. Humans building structures, operating machines, caring for their young. They seemed peaceful enough, if primitive by council standards. The scans showed they had weapons, but nothing that could threaten a spacefaring civilization. Their most powerful explosives were simple atomic devices, barely enough to scratch a council ship's shields. "I recommend we proceed with contact," Gray announced. "They meet the minimum requirements, and their peaceful nature makes them suitable candidates for guided development." He highlighted several data points. "Look at their entertainment content. Most of it focuses on cooperation, peaceful resolution, and community building." The council members murmured in agreement. Humans seemed harmless enough, perhaps even charming in their simplicity. They voted unanimously to proceed with first contact, designating Earth as a Class 3 non-threatening species. Gray prepared his contact team, selecting members who had experience with gentler species. They would need to be patient, careful not to overwhelm the humans with too much advanced technology or complex information at once. The standard protocols for primitive species would work well: simple demonstrations of peaceful intent, basic technological gifts, and careful cultural exchange. As the ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, cloaked to avoid causing panic, Gray reviewed the first contact location. The humans had a structure called the United Nations, where representatives from their various territories gathered. It seemed an ideal place to begin diplomatic relations. "Remember," he instructed his team, "these beings are fragile both physically and mentally. Our preliminary scans show no signs of significant military capability or combat experience. They've had small territorial disputes, but nothing approaching real warfare. Treat them gently." The ship settled invisibly above the UN building in New York. Gray's team prepared their appearance-altering fields to seem less intimidating to the humans. They would appear smaller, softer, with fewer appendages and eyes. No need to frighten such simple creatures. As final preparations were made, Gray felt confident about this mission. Earth would make a fine addition to the Council's Protected Worlds program. These humans, with their short lives and limited capabilities, would benefit greatly from galactic guidance. Perhaps in a few centuries, they might even advance enough to join the Council's junior assembly. Little did Gray know that in selecting the UN as their landing site, they had already made their first mistake in understanding humanity. For beneath the surface of diplomatic niceties and peaceful cooperation lay something the Council's scans had failed to detect. Thousands of years of martial knowledge, carefully contained but never forgotten. The UN Security Council sat in stunned silence as the holographic message from the alien ship played above their heads. First contact. After all these years of wondering, they were finally here. The room erupted into urgent whispers as officials debated their next move. "We need someone who understands both diplomacy and security," said the Secretary General, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Someone who can represent Earth's interests while maintaining peaceful relations." At the back of the room, Captain James Miller stood quietly, his dress uniform crisp despite the late hour. 20 years in the Marine Corps, followed by 5 years in diplomatic service, had taught him to read rooms like this one. The alien's message seemed peaceful enough, but something in their tone bothered him. It was almost patronizing. "Captain Miller," the Secretary General called out, "your record in both military and diplomatic service is exceptional. Would you be willing to serve as Earth's first representative to the Galactic Council?" Miller stepped forward, his combat boots clicking against the marble floor. Despite being retired from active service, he still moved with military precision. "Yes, sir. I would be honored." Hours later, Miller stood in the designated meeting area, watching as the alien ship decloaked. It was beautiful, he had to admit, like liquid mercury poured into the shape of a leaf. The landing ramp extended, and Miller got his first look at Ambassador Gray. The alien was tall, with multiple eyes and tentacles that seemed to shift color. More fascinating was the way it moved, carefully, deliberately, as if afraid of startling someone. Miller had seen that behavior before, when people approached animals they thought might spook easily. "Welcome to Earth," Miller said, maintaining perfect parade rest stance. "I'm Captain James Miller, Earth's designated representative." Gray's tentacles rippled in what might have been amusement. "Such a formal little being. Please, be at ease. We understand this must be overwhelming for your species." The alien's voice was soft, almost cooing. Miller kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. Every word, every gesture from the alien screamed of underestimation. They thought humans were cute, harmless, maybe even pet-like. This could be either dangerous or advantageous. Over the next few days, Gray and his team gave presentations about galactic politics. They spoke slowly, used simple terms, and repeatedly assured the humans that they needn't worry about understanding everything at once. Miller sat through it all, absorbing information while noting what they weren't saying. The aliens had classified Earth as Class 3 non-threatening. Their scans had focused on current technology, but seemed to ignore historical data. They saw humans' lack of natural weapons as weakness, failing to understand how it had driven innovation. Most importantly, they had mistaken humanity's choice for peace as an inability to wage war. "Such a pleasant species," Gray commented to his team after another session. "See how quietly they sit and listen. No arguments, no aggression. This is why I enjoy working with peaceful races." Miller thought about the combat knife hidden in his boot, the years of training in his muscles, the centuries of warfare in his DNA. He thought about the submarines lurking in Earth's oceans, the missiles in their silos, the special forces teams standing ready across the globe, all carefully hidden, all hoping they'd never be needed again. "We're peaceful because we choose to be," Miller muttered under his breath as he left the conference room. But looking at Gray's patronizing expression, he wondered how long it would take the aliens to understand the difference between choosing not to fight and being unable to fight at all. The grand reception hall of the Galactic Council space station glittered with the light of 1,000 stars. Miller stood among the alien diplomats, feeling smaller than usual in his dress uniform. Most species here were at least twice his height. The Ravagers, particularly, towered over everyone with their black-scaled bodies and sharp crystal growths. Miller didn't like the Ravagers, not because of their appearance, but because of how they moved. He'd spent enough time in combat zones to recognize predatory behavior. They weren't here for diplomacy. Ambassador Gray floated nearby, his tentacles a pleased shade of pink as he showed off his charming human diplomat to other council members. Observe how well they adapt. Captain Miller has learned our basic protocols in just weeks. Such quick learning for a simple species. Miller kept his face carefully neutral, but his combat-trained senses were on high alert. The Ravagers were spreading out across the room in a pattern he'd seen too many times before. Classic infiltration formation. His right hand stayed close to his concealed boot knife, forbidden by protocol, but brought anyway. 20 years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts. The attack came during Ambassador Gray's speech about peaceful cooperation. The station's lights went dark, and the Ravagers moved with frightening speed. Their crystal growths began glowing with deadly energy. Death to the Council. The battle cry rang out as energy weapons materialized from hidden compartments in the Ravager's scales. The other aliens panicked. Some froze, others tried to run. The Council's security systems had been sabotaged, and their peaceful species had no concept of how to handle violence. Miller didn't hesitate. He grabbed Gray and threw the surprised ambassador behind a pillar as energy blasts scorched the air. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable command of a combat veteran. The nearest Ravager turned toward them, weapon charging. Miller moved. Years of close combat training took over. He crossed the distance before the Ravager could fire, boot knife finding the weak point between scales. The giant alien fell, and Miller was already moving to the next target. 3 more Ravagers converged on him. Miller used their size against them, staying inside their reach where their long arms couldn't effectively target him. His knife found vital points with surgical precision. Each strike was calculated, efficient, lethal. This wasn't a bar fight. This was combat, and Miller was a master of his craft. The remaining Ravagers, expecting easy prey, found themselves facing something they didn't understand. The small, soft human moved like a war machine, each action practiced and precise. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation, just the cold application of lethal force. When station security finally arrived, they found Miller standing in the center of the room, surrounded by fallen Ravagers. His uniform was torn. There was a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were clear and alert. He still held his combat stance, knife ready. The other diplomats emerged from hiding, staring at the human with new eyes. Gone was the cute, harmless creature they'd patronized. In its place stood a warrior, someone who understood violence intimately enough to control it. Gray approached slowly, his tentacles pale with shock. "Captain Miller, we had no idea your species was capable of such." Combat efficiency. Miller finished for him, finally relaxing his stance. "There's a lot about humans you don't know, Ambassador. Let's hope you never have to learn more." The council chamber felt colder than usual as Miller stood before the assembled alien representatives. The Ravager incident had sparked an emergency session, and now every species wanted answers about humanity's combat capabilities. "Explain yourself, Captain Miller," Council Leader Stone demanded. "How does a supposedly peaceful species possess such lethal combat skills?" Miller stood at parade rest, his boots planted firmly on the floating platform that brought him to eye level with the larger aliens. "What you witnessed was standard close-quarter combat training, taught to every Marine in basic training. Nothing special by our standards." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Ambassador Gray's tentacles turned a sickly yellow. "Basic training? You mean all humans can fight like this?" "Those who serve in our military forces, yes. What you saw was actually quite restrained. I followed standard rules of engagement and laws of warfare." "Laws of warfare?" Stone's crystalline body pulsed with confusion. "You mean your species needed laws to enable combat?" Miller shook his head. "No, sir. We needed laws to limit it. The Geneva Convention, rules of engagement, laws of armed conflict. These weren't created to help us fight. They were created to put boundaries around how we fight." The silence in the chamber grew deeper. Miller continued, his voice steady. Humans have been waging war for thousands of years. We've become so good at it that we had to create international laws to prevent us from going too far. What you classify as combat would barely qualify as a skirmish in human terms. He brought up holographic images from Earth's military history. Tanks rolling across deserts, ships launching missiles, aircraft carriers slicing through oceans. These are just our conventional weapons, the ones we're willing to use. Then there are the ones we've banned ourselves from using because they're too destructive. The council members watched in growing horror as Miller explained concepts like total war, scorched earth tactics, and mutual assured destruction. He told them about humanity's darkest moments: world wars, nuclear weapons, chemical warfare, and how each horror had led to new laws restricting combat. "You mean?" Gray interrupted, his color now ash-gray. "Humans are capable of planetary-scale warfare, but choose not to engage in it." "Exactly," Miller nodded. "We're not peaceful because we can't fight. We're peaceful because we know exactly how terrible war can be. Every rule, every treaty, every convention, they're not signs of weakness. They're proof that we're strong enough to restrict ourselves." The council members looked at each other with new understanding. Their scans had detected Earth's current weapons, but had missed the centuries of martial knowledge behind them. They'd seen humans' lack of natural weapons as a weakness, never realizing it had driven them to create artificial ones of devastating power. "This changes everything," Stone declared. "We must completely reassess humanity's classification." Miller stood silently, watching the realization spread through the chamber. Humanity wasn't harmless. They were just very, very good at containing their capacity for violence. And now the galaxy knew it. Deep in the Council's archive chamber, surrounded by holographic displays, Ambassador Gray and his research team pored over Earth's military history. Each new discovery made their color fade further. The Art of War by Sun Tzu flickered on one screen. Their military theory predates their industrial age. One researcher noted, tentacles trembling. They were already masters of strategy before they had powered flight. Another display showed the Battle of Thermopylae. 300 warriors held off an army of thousands. They didn't even have energy weapons, just metal spears and shields. The researchers' crystalline form dimmed with disbelief. Gray moved between displays, each showing different aspects of human warfare. The Crusades, the Mongol Empire, the World Wars, nuclear proliferation, the Cold War, guerrilla warfare, each conflict more sophisticated than the last, each leading to new rules of engagement. "Look at this," Gray called out, his color shifting rapidly. "The Geneva Convention. They created it after something called World War II. Not because they couldn't fight worse, but because they could fight too well." The displays showed scenes from different eras: Roman legions in formation, medieval knights charging into battle, trenches stretching across continents, ships larger than council buildings launching aircraft, special forces operators moving like ghosts through hostile territory. "Their entire history is defined by warfare," one researcher observed, "but not just the act of fighting. The philosophy of it, the strategy, the ethics." He brought up more documents: the laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, treaties on chemical and biological weapons. Gray studied a document about nuclear deterrence. They created weapons that could destroy their entire planet, then chose not to use them. Instead, they built complex systems of diplomacy and mutually assured destruction. The research team found military academies, special forces training programs, martial arts dojos. Humanity hadn't just studied warfare. They'd elevated it to an art form, then deliberately placed restrictions on it. Their current peace isn't from weakness, Gray realized. It's from wisdom. They're not incapable of violence. They're masters of it who chose restraint. More displays lit up. The United Nations, NATO, peacekeeping missions, international laws, all built by a species that had learned the true cost of unrestricted warfare. "We made a terrible mistake," Gray announced. "We saw their lack of natural weapons as weakness. We should have asked why they didn't need them anymore." The archives painted a clear picture. Humans weren't just another species that had discovered warfare. They had shaped it, mastered it, and then willingly put limits on their own power. They maintained peace not through inability, but through choice. As if to emphasize this point, the final display showed Captain Miller's combat performance against the Ravagers. His movements weren't just trained responses. They were the culmination of thousands of years of human combat evolution, executed with precision and restraint. Gray's color settled into a deep, worried blue. The Council had completely misunderstood humanity. They weren't harmless. They were simply very, very good at containing their capacity for violence. And now the galaxy had to reckon with that truth. The Council's emergency session stretched into its third day. The chamber had split into two clear factions: those who saw humans as a threat to be contained, and those who wanted to forge stronger alliances with them. "They're too dangerous to be allowed free access to the galaxy," thundered the Ravager representative, his crystal growths flashing with anger. "A species that created nuclear weapons before achieving spaceflight. They'll destroy us all." "That's exactly why we need them as allies," countered Ambassador Gray, his tentacles now a confident purple. "They understand warfare better than any of us, yet choose peace. Think about what we could learn from them." Miller stood quietly on his platform, watching the debate unfold. The Council's scans of Earth's military archives had sparked a diplomatic crisis unlike anything in galactic history. Some species had withdrawn their ambassadors. Others were suddenly very interested in trade agreements with Earth. "What about their classified military technologies?" asked another representative. "Their special forces and black projects. How do we know they're showing us everything?" "We don't," Miller finally spoke. "Just like we don't know all of your secrets." Trust works both ways. A holographic display activated, showing scenes from Earth's history, peace treaties being signed after devastating wars, former enemies becoming allies, soldiers serving as peacekeepers. "You're all missing the point," Miller continued. "Humans aren't peaceful because we've evolved beyond violence. We're peaceful because we understand it too well. Every treaty, every agreement, every diplomatic mission. They exist because we know the alternative." The chamber fell silent as Miller's words sank in. They discovered that humans weren't just another primitive species stumbling into the galactic community. They were warriors who had chosen to be diplomats, fighters who had learned to be peacekeepers. "The question isn't whether humans are dangerous," Gray addressed the Council. "The question is whether we're wise enough to understand why they choose not to be." More displays activated, showing Earth's humanitarian missions, disaster relief efforts, and peacekeeping operations, a species that could wage total war, choosing instead to help others rebuild. "We need to reclassify Earth immediately," Council Leader Stone declared. "They're not Class 3 non-threatening. They're Class 1 self-restricted." The new classification sent shockwaves through the galactic community. No species had ever been promoted from Class 3 to Class 1 in a single step. But then, no species had ever hidden such capacity for both destruction and mercy behind such a peaceful exterior. 1 year after the Ravager incident, the Galactic Council chamber looked very different. Human diplomatic officers now stood alongside alien representatives, their presence a reminder of how much had changed. Captain Miller, now permanent ambassador, watched as the latest class of alien diplomats listened to his lecture on human history. "The strength of humanity isn't in our weapons," Miller explained, pacing before the group. "It's in knowing when not to use them. Every species here developed weapons after achieving peace. Humans did it backwards. We found peace because we understood war too well." The chamber's displays showed Earth's current military forces alongside its humanitarian missions. Nuclear submarines patrolling oceans while hospital ships delivered aid to disaster zones. Special forces training exercises next to peacekeeping operations. "A year ago, you thought we were harmless," Miller continued. "Now some of you think we're terrifying. The truth is somewhere in between. We're not pacifists pretending to be warriors, or warriors pretending to be pacifists. We're both, because we learned we had to be. Ambassador Gray, now Earth's strongest ally in the Council, watched from his platform. His color had settled into a deep, wise blue. The past year had seen unprecedented changes in galactic politics. Species that had never bothered with military defense now studied human combat doctrine. Worlds that had relied purely on force began exploring human-style diplomatic solutions. The galaxy is changing, Council Leader Stone announced to the Assembly. For millennia, we believed that advanced civilizations naturally evolved beyond warfare. Humans proved us wrong. They showed us that true peace doesn't come from inability to fight, but from the wisdom to choose not to. The Council had reorganized its entire classification system. Humanity's unique path, developing restraint through understanding violence rather than through avoiding it, had revealed a blind spot in galactic civilization. Species were no longer rated just on their technological advancement, but on their understanding of both conflict and peace. Miller's combat knife, now mounted in a display case in the Council chamber, had become a symbol of this new understanding. Beside it stood the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and other documents showing humanity's journey from warfare to controlled peace. We're not joining the galactic community because we're harmless, Miller concluded his lecture. We're joining because we chose to be peaceful while remembering how to be dangerous. That's the hardest balance any species can strike. The chamber lights dimmed as Miller finished speaking. In the years since the Ravager attack, 17 diplomatic incidents had been resolved using human-inspired protocols. 3 potential wars had been prevented. And for the first time, the galaxy understood that true civilization wasn't about removing the capacity for violence. It was about mastering it. Welcome to the new age of galactic diplomacy, Miller said softly, where we keep peace not because we must, but because we choose to, and where we remember how to fight, so that we never have to.